I'm Peter Mayers, and thank you to Michael. Thank you to Vic for inviting me to moderate this session. I think, as Michael said, I have a background at ABC Radio National now at the Grattan Institute, but it's nice to sort of bring back my journalistic skills a bit and chair this session. And I think it says a lot about the importance of public transport in our political thinking in the policy world that we have such a senior selection from right around Australia of senior officials, directors from different agents from each state and territory, apart from the NT, to talk about the issues. So I'm going to introduce them all to you. Kristin Blume is from the ACT government, where she's Senior Manager, Transport and Policy Coordination in the Environment and Sustainable Development Directorate. Next to her, McIlfatrick is Secretary in the Department of Infrastructure, Energy and Resources in Tasmania. From Western Australia, Mark Burgess is Managing Director of the Public Transport Authority, WA. Representing New South Wales, Wielinga, Director General, Transport... Oh, I beg your pardon, I missed Ian Dobbs here. Ian Dobbs, who is CEO of Public Transport Victoria. Wielinga from New South Wales, Director General, Transport for New South Wales. From Queensland, Michael McGee. Now, Michael is the Executive Director, Bus, Coach, Ferry and Air Services in the Translink division of the Queensland Government. So it's got everything except trains. That's right, Michael? Yep. And Rod Hook is CEO with SA's Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure. I'm not going to give you their full CVs. They're in the program. You can look them up yourselves. Needless to say, we have a huge wealth of expertise here about public transport, management, planning, and they're going to tell us what the future holds. So my first question is going to go to each participant in turn. I'm also going to invite you in the audience to ask questions as we go along if you've got questions to ask or contributions to make. Once we've heard from everyone, then feel free to stick up your hand if you think there's an important issue to put on the table. The first question is about the big transport challenges facing your capital city or larger regional centres. What are the big challenges in the next 5 to 10 years? So, Kristin Blume, over to you. Oh, and they're all sharing microphones, so we're going to pass the baton a bit as we go along. Kristin.
Hi, look, I just...
Should be on.
Yep. I just wanted to start by mentioning that, as you probably know, the ACT government's still in caretaker mode, so...
Bring that microphone right
Sorry.
up, that's it.
The ACT government's still in caretaker mode, so I'll try and contribute as much as I can, but I do have to be a little bit circumspect around particular areas, so I'll keep that as discreet as I can. But look, I think clearly the ACT, we're pretty small, but we do have rising congestion. We've got some pinch points forming around particularly our access to the city, and we have the opportunity, I think, in the ACT to really look at what's happened to some of the bigger cities around the country and learn from that. Some of the other challenges that I think will probably be common across the board are things like the role of public transport in addressing transport-related social exclusion. We've done some really interesting work in the ACT in that area. Looking at, of course, dealing with the emissions and the growing emissions from the transport task. Declining physical activity. Certainly the report that was released by Minister Albanese this morning is a really interesting summary of some of the ways to help people access public transport, walking and riding being a really useful part of that as well. We have cross-border issues with Canberra, where we've got a very large regional town of Queanbeyan right on our border, and integration is a really important challenge that I know is certainly a feature in Queensland and New South Wales as well with our cross-border transport challenges, and of course the perennial issue, I guess, of balancing transport investments, not only within the transport sector between different modes and different types of transport, but also across, we're a city-state and other states have to grapple with this too, trying to make those choices about prioritising transport when you're also talking about health and education and all the other things that need to be funded. So I imagine there'll be some common themes.
Kristin, I'm just going to ask you one follow-up question now. I know that it's caretaker mode and we've just had an election. But one of the issues at the election was discussion about light rail for Canberra. From a logistical point of view, do you have any comments on light rail as an option for Canberra?
Look, I think Canberra would have a lot to learn from the Gold Coast if we did have a new mode introduced into the ACT. They've certainly had to do lots of interesting things with their industry. They've had to train up technicians. They've had to bring in expertise from around the country to really learn about how a new mode will operate. And it will create some complexities. If it did come in as a mode, it will be on a single corridor, and so the issue of transfers and interchanging becomes absolutely critical, and a light rail mode couldn't work in Canberra without a really effective and functioning bus network. I'll just add to that, I guess, and I might come back to this a little bit later. We've been doing some very interesting strategic planning in Canberra to take advantage of the planned city and our really strong town centre nodes, which actually have reservations for public transport reserved between them. And we are building some infrastructure that is actually putting bus priority in place, which will work as part of a network, whatever modes we actually have on that system.
And I'd hate to correct a federal government minister, but the minister this morning said that Canberra was built for the car, but in fact Burley-Griffin did envisage light rail in Canberra, I think, when he drew up the plans.
Yeah, so the original Burley-Griffin plans you may have seen do have a tram network, and there was some rail infrastructure in place. A big bridge got washed away across the lake in the 1930s, I believe. So there was a bit of an intention for some walkable catchments to public transport, particularly in the core of the city. So really moving towards perhaps light rail, perhaps bus rapid transit will be part of the way that Canberra can be planned for the future, I think.
Okay, Norm McIlfatrick from Tasmania, what are the biggest challenges for you?
I'm only invited here because we only have buses, so I'm a perennial invitee. Look, our challenges are not huge when we look at other capital cities. We don't have a massive congestion driver to getting cars out of the city. However, we do have a large health issue, which I think the Minister mentioned this morning as one of the underlying reasons why we want to get people more walking, cycling and connecting with the active transport. We've got a huge opportunity facing us right now that in the next 5 to 10 years our rail yard site, which is right on the Hobart waterfront, will be cleaned up and made available for development. 8 hectares plus right in the middle of the city. If we can't make a passenger transport and an active transport opportunity out of that, we're not really trying. So the drivers at the moment are that there isn't a huge burning platform for major change because people are happy with the bus network. There are all sorts of opportunities that come up, such as ferries on the Derwent. Light rail comes up quite often, and it's active at the moment being looked at. But until we get a real driver for getting people out of the car into the bus and active transport network, we haven't really moved their minds towards the passenger transport option. And that would make light rail very, very difficult, and will certainly make ferries very difficult. So our concentration at the moment is making the passenger transport network we have work better for the real commuter, and probably the other challenge for us is that we have a mixture of private and public bus services, and the ticketing needs to be integrated to make that work better for passengers.
So you don't have integrated ticketing at the moment between those two?
We have a card for our public bus operator, but no integration between the private. And given the public operators only in the metros, then it will be very essential for us to have integrated ticketing within a few years if we're going to make that work.
And you said that congestion's not a big driver, but I have been stuck in traffic in Hobart. I mean, the peak doesn't last as long, but it can jam up in there, and you know, Hobart's a beautiful old city, and when it's dominated by cars like that, there's something lost, I think.
Yeah, so I think the whole focus we have at the moment is, and Hobart, a traffic jam, is if you can see the car in front of you, by the way. The focus at the moment is to overcome the public perception that the car has the right of way. So really priority bus lanes, in fact re-engineering our major corridor routes to make the bus have priority is the key. We now have a Minister for Sustainable Transport, separate to the Transport Minister. That helps. It doesn't help my job, but it helps given that I've got both ministers to report to, but it does help get a focus, a very necessary focus on this element of our transport network, which we should all agree has been neglected probably by all governments over the last 20 years. Okay,
thank you. Mark Burgess from Western Australia. I mean, you've had the huge rail success in WA, which I think is maybe an exception to what we see in every other capital city where people talk about rail all the time and never build it. You've built the Mandurah line. The capacity has been exceeded in a much quicker time, or reached in a much quicker time than expected. So what are the challenges for public transport more generally in WA?
You're right, Peter. The patronage expectations of the Mandurah line were met within the, targets for 5 years were met within the first 12 months. That's all about the growth in Perth. Perth is growing at an alarming rate, alarming in the sense of trying to keep up with it. The last set of ABS stats that came out say 56,000 people came to WA in the last 12 months, and of those 45,000 roughly came into Perth. So if you think of a town of 45,000 people, that's a pretty sizable town in any state of Australia, but that size town is joining Perth every year. So Perth, not in raw terms, but in percentage terms, is growing faster than any other city in Australia. A lot of that's driven obviously by the mining boom, but all forms of government infrastructure struggle to keep up. Pardon me. All forms of government infrastructure struggle to keep up when you've got those growth rates, and public transport is no exception, even with a very functional train system, and we've obviously had integration for a long time in Perth. Probably, I'm sure a lot of people would like to have that level of integration, but a fully integrated bus, train and ferry system and a integrated ticketing system. And so both train and bus have enjoyed massive growth rates, but really struggled during the peak period. And of course, with that population growth rate, it's not just the public transport system that's struggling, the road system's struggling, the freight systems are struggling. So, the city is just growing at an alarming rate, and that's our great challenge. Most of those things can be easily remedied. You just need money, and that would be the common cry amongst all the colleagues up here on the stage. You just need money. We have all the plans, the designs are done, and you just need to be able to fund them. And of course, when our federal colleagues come over and talk to us, they throw up creative ideas like tolls and new taxes and so on, and we'd rather just get a cheque from the federal government if that was possible. But everyone asks for that, and clearly there's only so much money to go around. Like some of the other states, WA has had some pretty substantial efficiency dividends, or the creative titles never end. Efficiency dividends, harvest, productivity dividends. So we've all had those, and we've had 4 in the last 6 years. So whilst the need is greater, we're actually being cut occasionally with such dividends. So it's a challenge.
So a productivity dividend, from my days at the ABC, that was known as doing more with less. That's the general idea.
Yeah, money gets taken off the bottom line.
Yep. And now you mentioned that the rail and buses and other services are fully integrated. Obviously, the single ticketing system is part of that, but when you say fully integrated, that means when you get off a train, there's a bus waiting. When you get off a bus, there's a train about to come in. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it'll be a long time, I think, before we ever get to that there's a bus for every train. The trains are obviously, just 5 lines, and they're a primary spine. They're carrying very large numbers of people. So there's 5 lines versus 340 bus routes. Not all the bus routes are feeder routes, but a large proportion are. And it's, the cost, it would just be excessive to have a bus for every possible train service on every route.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the aim when you talk about networking integration. That's
what I mean by integration is that as the Managing Director of PTA, not me specifically, but the organisation controls every aspect of public transport in the state. So we control the specifications. We obviously work closely with our contractors. Where it's delivered by a contractor, they come up with great ideas for new routes and altered timetables, but that specification is ultimately controlled by the PTA, and so clearly the planning is done to try and achieve the best integration we can. Certainly ticketing has been integrated for more than 30 years, so that puts us a fair way ahead of some people.
Okay. Ian Dobbs from Victoria.
I think I'd put the challenges we've got into 3 categories, Peter. The first one is very much similar to Western Australia, and that's capacity. We've seen, again, phenomenal growth on our systems in the last 10 years, really. On the rail system, for instance, we've seen 70% growth in 7 years, and with the kind of people we're carrying, the numbers, that's quite phenomenal by any standards. So on the rail system and the tram system, very much about creating additional capacity. We're seeing about 80,000 people a year net arriving in Victoria. A lot of those people are moving to suburbs on the city fringe, in Melbourne, and that's giving us significant problems on rail and tram. Funnily enough, I think on bus, the capacity challenge is around actually filling what is a significant amount of capacity. We haul around a lot of fresh air every day on bus in Melbourne, which means, in my mind, that we're not providing, at the moment, the right services to the right people. So I think there's a different kind of challenge on bus, and that's to actually give it a much more meaningful role in Melbourne. And really that goes to the second issue as well, which is about quality and connectivity. We've got integrated ticketing, but we haven't got good coordinated transport in the city. We've got it by accident in some places, but what we're trying to do now is actually plan a far more effective coordinated system. Again, we won't be able to achieve a bus for every train, for instance, and vice versa, but just to get the bus timetable, for instance, on the same frequency as the train timetable, even if it's only every other train that we connect with, would be quite a start. And to have timetables that show absolutely no relationship to one another is clearly madness. So we're trying to do that in stages across the city in particular. And also we've got to get those services that we run on time. We've got to run them on time, because we know from research that if the services are running well, if they're running punctually, then actually people out there are pretty happy and everything else is good in the world. Doesn't matter how well we do everything else, how much money we spend, if the services don't run punctually, then we're deemed to have failed. And I think the final area, which probably is somewhat related to the capacity challenge, is cost and value for money. I don't think that we get enough out of what we put into the transport system at the moment. I've got a $5 billion budget, and I don't think I get at the moment $5 billion worth of value. So I think we've got to make sure that we use the money that we've got at the moment more effectively, and that we get actually better service levels, higher quality, more services, better connected services, before we go out with a begging bowl to either the state or the federal government.
Well, there's a couple of issues we'll certainly come back to there that have been raised. One is, where does the money come from? Where do we get the funding? And then secondly, your point, how do we use it more effectively to make sure we're actually using that money to its absolute maximum, I guess. Is one quick follow-up question for you, Ian, that is, in Victoria recently, or Melbourne recently, you've introduced Tram Tracker, which is a mobile phone application. So you're standing at a tram track and you can click on it and you can see how far away the next tram is, where the nearest tram might be, all sorts of stuff. Is that going to happen for buses as well?
It is actually, and the base system is live now, which is Bus Tracker, surprisingly. The trouble is, although I think in the past we've overspecified some of these systems and tried to be too clever with some of the information technology that we've introduced, I'm actually at the moment trying to dumb down some of our technology to make it more reliable. I would have preferred to have got Bus Tracker up and running quicker, but we've still got challenges with it. And the same with the rail system. I mean, we've been running trains in Melbourne for God knows how long.
Since 1856.
Well, your knowledge of history is even better than mine. But the problem is we still haven't actually got a system, a central tracking system, that can tell us where every train is all of the time, which is remarkable, really. So the technology we have introduced has been substandard.
I think the Tram Tracker makes a lot of difference as a patron, a sometime patron of trams. Normally I ride a bicycle, but to know when the tram is coming, even though you might still be waiting, it's that waiting and seeing nothing down the line, at least if you know it's coming. It does make a huge difference to patrons, I think. I think it'll be even better with buses, because on many of the tram routes, of course, you have pretty high frequencies. So, and actually also a lot of very good displays on stops in the city now. But actually when you're out in the suburbs waiting for a bus that might be running every 40 minutes, having that information is even more valuable. It's good to know whether you've just missed it or it's running a minute late. Les Wielinga, let's talk about New South Wales, which obviously I imagine has similar problems to Victoria and Perth around growth and managing capacity.
Yes, we do, Peter. You mentioned that you were looking at the major challenges sort of 5, 10 years out, I guess there's two significant ones for us. The important thing is the relationship between land use and the infrastructure systems that we need to develop, and painting a picture for the way your city is going to develop and how you can respond to that. Each city needs its infrastructure systems. It's not only transport but public health and public safety and water and sewage and energy and so forth. But transport plays a very significant role in those infrastructure systems. There is a relationship between the type of transport system and the type of city that you develop. And working that out in forward years is quite critical, and there is a challenge in developing sophisticated models to make those projections and to understand the travel desire lines and so forth. If you can get a good handle on that, you can design your transport systems to respond to that demand, and I emphasise demand, to make the community work. It's significantly different from wants that we hear about in a short-term framework. And that leads me into the second issue of significance, is understanding what the customers expect out of our transport systems and how we design for that and what we can realistically provide for those customers. And that in itself is a complex issue. But the relationship between land use, what's going to happen with our cities, what the desire lines are, what the demand is, developing a network, you then need to take a look at how all modes can satisfy those particular requirements and how you develop your transport systems temporally over the next 15 or 20 years.
And obviously in Sydney you're moving towards greater integration with ticketing and that sort of thing, and that's certainly part of the challenge, because you have had separate systems, haven't you?
Yeah, most of those issues have already been mentioned. We are moving towards those. We do have a long-term transport master plan. It is about investment, but it is also about getting more out of our existing systems. It's about making our operating entities efficient and effective. A significant reform process is needed before you go asking for extra money. You do need to get your own ducks in a row.
There does seem to be a difference in emphasis, if I can say this, between the Transport Master Plan and Infrastructure New South Wales ideas of what are needed. Infrastructure New South Wales seems to be projecting more heavily on roads and highways, new freeways, and the Transport Master Plan more on rail. Is that a fair comment, that there's a kind of divergence there?
I think when you study both documents carefully, you'll see that they're closer than people think. One does have a very strong emphasis on economics, the Infrastructure New South Wales plan, and that is understandable. But when you're looking at developing a transport system, there is a broader purview. We do have a lot of social issues we need to deal with, access, travel requirements of our community. The Infrastructure New South Wales plan is part of a broader package.
And that's about productivity rather than social?
Correct.
Okay. Michael McGee from Queensland, what are the major challenges ahead in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, thank you. I guess like my colleagues here, we've faced similar issues with the major states. I guess the first one for ourselves is a tight budget situation. Queensland at the moment has a very tight budget situation, so we've got to look at better ways we can utilise the current resources across the whole state and I guess maximise a better return from that investment for everybody in Queensland. The other, I guess, big issues going forward is the state itself is very, very large. The Translink division now has been rolled out across the whole state, so we're looking at integrating public transport across a massive region. But once you get outside of Brisbane and some of the regional areas, the population density is quite small. So that makes, I guess, return on public transport very hard to obtain, and we do carry a lot of fresh air in different areas, as Ian said.
So it's harder in a city like Townsville or something than it is, obviously, in Brisbane to get the numbers.
Definitely, and even from Brisbane itself, and just in SEQ, as you just move outside of the kind of the city areas, it can get quite sparse population. So how do we maximise those resources, get a good value for money for the taxpayer, and then deliver a good quality service for the customer? Kind of interesting challenge across all those three areas.
Okay, Rod Hook from South Australia.
Thanks, Peter. I think, look, for us in South Australia, the transport transport was given a real focus in government expenditure going back to about 2005. So we've had significant investment in some major projects. From 2008, also significant expenditure in public transport. I think the issues or the challenges for us over the next period of time, in the shorter term, it's to deliver the projects that we're currently funded to deliver and deliver those projects successfully. We're also in a space in our state where our 30-year plan for the city is targeting brownfields redevelopment, more people living around our transport corridors, and to have that integrated approach through our planning system. In the longer term, I suspect our challenge, probably not unlike what's going to happen in most other states, is that the community's expectations will exceed our ability to pay, and that's going to be a huge challenge for us going forward over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think the question of how we fund the things we might want is a big question for the population at large, as well as obviously for government and so on. Let me ask now a question about buses in particular, and whoever wants to answer can, and I expect there might be a few answers. There is a feeling, I think, in the bus industry. Well, we had this Danish ad, you know, to make buses sexy. Now, why do we need to make buses sexy? Well, possibly because they have an image problem relative to light rail or rail or heavy rail. And there is a sense, I think, that Directors General or other senior officials in transport departments don't give buses their due weight as a part of the urban transport network. Now, you know, maybe that's just being a bit paranoid, or maybe that's true. So I'd like to get your responses to that, whether buses are getting a fair share, given the role they can play, given their flexibility, given the role they can play in expanding suburban areas, outer growth areas, that sort of thing. So who wants to defend a record on?
Happy to jump in, Peter. Certainly I don't think that would be the case in WA. I've been involved in public transport for almost 15 years. Certainly the early part of those 15 years, we had a 33% increase over 3 years in the number of service kilometres over a 3-year period. So a massive growth in the bus industry in Perth. That was from 98 to 2001. More recently, in the 10-11 budget, the WA government increased bus service kilometres in the metropolitan area by almost 25% over a 5-year period. So we're in our second year of implementing that increase. Since '99, we've been doing a fleet replacement program on all the buses. So that is a constant fleet replacement program, and obviously we had a 12-year contract with Mercedes, and now that's a contract with Volvo. So that continues. In addition to that fleet replacement, we've been also the rollout of the 15 million extra service kilometres included an additional bus order of 158 buses. So I think in WA, the role that buses play is well and truly recognised. There was a large increase in bus services commensurate with the Mandurah line opening, a whole new range of feeder services. So I think from my perspective, the role is well and truly understood. We give great credence to our bus contractors. We've been outsourced completely since July '98, but government retains control of the asset, and the contractors do a very good job of delivering the service. But we work very closely with them. We've worked closely with them with implementing a complete CCTV system on the buses, our smart card system, which was obviously developed quite some years ago now, heavily involved the bus operators. They helped us substantially during the trials of that system. So I think it's a very close relationship, and I certainly don't find them undervalued, and I don't think they'd feel undervalued.
In other states or territories?
Yeah, I was going to say in Queensland, I think the government has invested quite heavily in buses in the recent years. You look at the busway.
Had the busway system, haven't you, in Brisbane?
And that's been great, and there's a lot of plans for expansion of that busway, so hopefully with some federal funds we can roll that out in years to come. Also, Campbell Newman, our Premier, who was the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, did a good job of putting 500 buses into Brisbane with Alan and his team. Of course, that was funded by the state government at the time. But I think the current government has definitely got to focus on bus and recognises that bus can deliver a lot more flexibility than rail can. So I think you'll see more investment coming through from bus.
Les.
Yeah, I think probably the bus industry is being a bit paranoid when it thinks that's the case, and now that I've said that, perhaps I should tell you why I think that's the case. When you have a look at public transport systems, each of the different modes have got an important role to play, and they each finish up with a sustainable competitive advantage depending on that particular role. Buses have got two things going for them. First is the flexibility, the ability to adjust those services to sort of suit the community demand and do it fairly quickly. And the other thing that they've got going for them is the proximity issue. You can get public transport close to people only with buses. And, you know, while ever that situation exists, and it will forever, buses will continue to play a significant role in any total transport system that you need.
Rod.
I think our South Australian experience is that we have invested in light rail extensions. We've spent $130 million putting tram lines in and through the city. We've got a $2 billion program to upgrade our train system and to electrify our tracks. But 80 to 85% of our customers travel on bus. So it is still important to us. I guess the observation I would make is that what people enjoy about train and light rail is they don't get caught in traffic. They have priority access, they take access over roads when it comes to an intersection.
You've got grade separation so that they, yep.
We have some grade separations. I'd like a lot more, Peter. What we would need to continue to do, and of course our city enjoys our only Oban, that is a priority corridor for buses, works brilliantly well, but I think we need to continue to find ways to give buses priority over cars, and as we do that, buses will continue to become progressively more sexy too.
I think we have buses only, so the bus industry has to have a competitive advantage that they're there. The major challenge, I think, in Tasmania and probably the other smaller states is that the bus network has been seen as primarily for social inclusion. So we're predominated by concession travellers. We don't have enough of the commuter travellers such as, say, Melbourne and Sydney would have. So the big challenge for the bus industry and government is to move those bums onto the seats in the buses for the full fare paying passenger, reduces my burden of sort of public sector support, but also makes the bus industry much more viable. And that'll be about frequency of services, and really where we can step in is to help with the priority lanes and the corridor planning. Where the bus industry can help is to work with us to improve the image for those commuters in particular that see the bus as a valid way of getting to and from work.
Ian, yep.
I think this works both ways. I think there is a degree of paranoia. Again, in Victoria, there's been substantial investment in new routes and vehicles and a significant increase in kilometres, which has been very successful. But at the same time, I think that outside of those new routes, probably there's not been a great deal of attention to what we've got, and there's not been a lot of progressive thinking into how we might develop the system to be more responsive and to coordinate better with rail and tram. So I think it works both ways, but I'm quite passionate that we need to get a lot more passengers on the bus service. And I think that's where we've really failed on a substantial amount of the network, and we've got to work with the industry to do that.
And if you get more passengers, the industry will have more weight, presumably. I mean, it will have more influence and a bigger say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And not only that, but I mean, the whole system will work better. If we can get that, for instance, coming back to connectivity, if we can get that working better, it'll become an attractive proposition from the doorstep to the CBD.
Kristin.
I guess I'd have to echo some of what Norm was saying. You know, it is harder in the smaller cities, but Canberra has, I believe, one of the highest performing bus corridors in the whole country between our city and Belconnen Town Centre. We've got 2 universities, and you know, it really is a very substantial and very, very popular corridor. Buses run every 3 to 5 minutes all day. and we've had this corridor in place since the 1970s. So we've actually got some great examples of where buses can actually really perform that mass passenger movement. But like other cities as well, we have a lot of low density, quite circuitous areas, and it's a real challenge to get that connectivity happening to make the bus an attractive mode when you've not only got a long distance within a suburb to circulate through, but also a long distance to get to where people are trying to go. So I think that's sort of a perennial challenge for all of us.
Well, I'd like to come to that. I just want to remind the audience, if you've got a question that you'd like to put about a particular state or a particular territory or issue, then please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. So we've got one down here. Just before we come to your question, John, I want to pick up on something that came through in all those comments, and that's the relative, the role of public transport, but buses in particular, because we're trying to do several things, aren't we? On the one hand, there's the environmental thing. We want people out of their cars because we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing is the congestion and greater productivity by reducing congestion, better public transport. But then buses in particular are there for, as we heard, people who don't have other transport options, so a social inclusion role, and that doesn't fit very well with the getting people to work role quickly. How do you balance those two things, the social inclusion versus the productivity and efficiency? The trip to work. Ian, I'm looking at you.
It's a balance. I mean, there's no easy solution to it, but I think what we need to do is to look whether the design of the network we've got at the moment actually suits everybody or suits nobody. And I think the problem is that we've probably compromised to such a degree that we're actually offering a product that a lot of people are not interested in, and that's a worry. Yeah,
because a lot of buses you have to be time rich in order to catch a bus because it goes around all the houses and to every shopping centre, and most people who want to commute to work are time poor. So there's a real challenge there, isn't there?
And that's part of I guess the skill of network design and timetabling. It's actually getting that mix of services right, where you're combining those kind of services that go very close to people's doorsteps, along with trunk haul routes that actually take significant numbers of people wherever they need to go, whether that's the CBD or the station or the shopping centre.
Les, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, look, the solution lies in developing a hierarchy of services depending on customer need. For those high volume areas between major centres, the key issue is travel time and frequency of service, and you need to tailor the bus services to satisfy that need. When you're dealing with local bus services, proximity becomes the dominant issue, and you need to construct a bus network with effective interchanges between those different types of services to address those different customer needs.
So you need a clear hierarchy and you need efficient mode change, or in this case not mode change, but from local bus networks to sort of high volume fast route buses and that sort of thing.
Correct, and we've seen some evidence of that in Sydney with the development of our metro bus network with the red buses, and the growth has been highest on those for us on our bus network in Sydney.
Kristin.
I was just going to add, I think one of the really useful things, and I know a lot of other jurisdictions have done this in major cities as well, is just trying to increase the travel choices people have. I mean, I think segregating your market's useful sometimes, but you don't want to actually be doing too much specialisation because you can actually dilute the whole service. You might not be maximising value for your services. So one of the really important things, we're just really starting to expand our network of park and ride facilities, and I think that's something that really helps people have the more flexible end of the trip, avoid the circuitous local route if they are trying to commute from those suburban areas, and it could be about affordability and other reasons people choose to live in these suburbs. Sorry, and so park and ride becomes a really important way to help people access the trunk routes as well.
Park and ride though means a lot of land for car parking, doesn't it? A lot of land tied up in car parking, Rod.
Look, our public transport system, like all other states or jurisdictions, is a subsidised service. We have a social equity objective, and that's carrying people who perhaps can't afford other transport modes. We have a sustainability objective because we want people to be on a bus rather than in their car, but we also offer free public transport for seniors off-peak because we would encourage them not to be on buses when the workers are going to town, and we offer them free travel off-peak, which is part of that social equity.
I might just add, Peter, I mean, the first wave of reform, if I can put it that way, when we had finished outsourcing bus services, taking it from a monopoly government operator and outsourcing it over the 96 to 98 period, the contractors, and largely still the same in many ways, contractors who took over those services certainly understood our desire, which was to clean up the bus routes in Perth. And if you threw a map down on the table now of the bus routes in Perth relative to the one that they inherited, the two do not look the same. They have made them direct bus routes. They've taken the squiggly bits, so, you know, the bit around the block and circle around 3 times. That's all gone with our absolute support. And you'll find that the history of a lot of those very convoluted bus routes was some poor old lady who wrote to a backbencher, who influenced a minister, who got a government bus company to put a... And she, poor old dear, passed away 15 years ago, but the bus route was still there. A lot of that got cleaned up in those 3 years of absolute change, and we haven't gone backwards. So if you can make bus routes much more direct, whether it's to a bus train interchange, in other words a feeder service, whether it's to a regional bus station, or whether it's a CBD direct service, you'll get lots more people. And that's what we experienced, massive growth in those years of patronage, because no one chooses to get in their car and on their way to town divert 3 times and go around the block, you know, and it just doesn't happen. So you have to make bus routes competitive. It is a fine balance between, you know, getting into the suburb and reaching those who are perhaps accessibility disadvantaged, but there are other ways of doing that. And like Rod, we also picked up the issue. In fact, you know, we were the first state to put on the free public transport for seniors and pensioner concession card holders from 9 till 3:30 to try and move those people out of the peak period if they had discretionary travel, so that hopefully you free up the commuter services for commuters.
Okay, let's take the question. That's John Stanley, yeah?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, John Stanley. I'm a sort of public transport has-been and a renaissance man in land use transport at the moment. You challenged the panel to have a bit of vision looking out 5, 10 years. I didn't hear a lot in the presentation. I heard a lot of let's do better what we're already doing. If you had a bit more money, and pretend you're not public servants at the moment, but you know, get out there, have a bit of vision, and if you had a lot more money to invest in your systems, how would you spend it to improve those services? And a second one, as somebody who travels a lot between Melbourne and Sydney, can I use my smart card interchangeably around Australia, or are we back in the old 19th century railway days?
Okay, so 2 questions there. Basically, the Commonwealth's just come into a huge amount of money. That mining tax suddenly started working, and all this bountiful money, and they're giving it out to all the states and territories. You don't have a budgetary problem. What are you going to do? What's the vision for your state or your capital city?
A couple of things clearly in my mind for Adelaide. I wouldn't have a railway station finishing in a cul-de-sac on the edge of the city. I'd have it connected underground and keep the rolling stock moving rather than go into a cul-de-sac.
So you'd have trains going east-west, north-south, rather than just in and out? Yeah.
Well, I think our lines are probably going to be primarily north-south, but I'd connect them and keep them moving, and I wouldn't have an O-Bahn track that gave priority access from the far north-east suburbs to near the city, and then you get caught in the road traffic and it takes longer to go the last
So to have priority access, but giving it priority access all the way through,
right into the city.
That wouldn't cost anything.
Sorry?
Giving the O-Bahn priority access all the way into the city, that actually wouldn't cost anything, besides a lot of political capital.
I can find a way to make it cost, because we can do some overpasses for the buses.
Okay, other visions for the future in your state or capital city, territory? Yeah. Michael?
Well, we'll keep going around.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, had unlimited money. First thing I guess I'd do is infrastructure. Got to admit the busway in Brisbane's working quite well. I'd like to see that rolled out across the state, not just in Brisbane itself. I guess a re-overhaul of the whole network possibly in terms of a hub and spoke. You guys mentioned it before, the panel up here. But the hub and spoke is quite important, so we can increase the frequency of higher runs, so you get rid of those milk runs and have feeders coming in from the areas that are needed.
So you'd have hub and spokes, and then at the end of each spoke you have a kind of network that feeds that spoke, as it were.
And to put the hub and spoke, of course, you need very good interchanges. So you've got to look at different things. So for example, the feeders may be flexible cab services through to midi buses driving people in that only pick up 5 to 6 people, versus an interchange which may then pick up a couple hundred people per hour. So different modes, different needs. That makes sense going forward, but definitely infrastructure rolling out.
Les, we'll keep going round. Yep.
It's a good question in the sense that, you know, it's something that we dream about occasionally, but I just want to make the point, it's never going to happen, but even if it did, what you do is accelerate the plans that you've got now. You know, I spoke earlier about the importance of relating your transport systems and your infrastructure systems to land use outcomes. Each city's got a set of objectives that they see as important. One of Sydney's is to grow public transport usage. So certainly strong investment being pushed into that initially, probably focused on making our existing systems work better, bus networks run faster with better priority on the system, new technology, information systems, new rolling stock vehicles and vessels to make them perform as well as they can would be a priority for us. You'd structure those things around some quick wins and some longer term outcomes that you were looking to achieve.
Ian.
I'd echo what Les says about whether there's any chance of it happening or not. And I think the days of the big federal handouts have gone, and they're not going to be around for a hell of a lot longer. I'd start on buses with higher frequencies, and I'd look to improve the coverage we've got of the new growth areas, which I think is fairly ordinary at the moment. With tram, I'd be putting my money into more high-capacity vehicles, so not necessarily running more trams in the short term, but bigger trams that load and unload more easily in the CBD, and also possibly redesigning the distribution of routes through the CBD itself, because it's basically the CBD's changed over the last 20 years. And on rail, I'd start with high-capacity signalling, so I can run more trains. I'd buy more high-capacity trains, so I could take more people on each vehicle, and I'd be investing in Melbourne Metro as the first stage of providing more capacity through the middle of the city, and actually freeing up train paths on virtually every other line in the city to absorb growth over the next 20 years, which we think is going to more than double, incidentally. We're predicting around about 4% compound growth on the system overall. If it accelerates beyond that, and it has done in the last 10 years, then we've got an even bigger challenge.
You've got to get rid of those level crossings as well in Melbourne, of course. That's another challenge in Melbourne. Mark.
Thanks, Peter. I guess for this audience, the good news is, I mean, they want to hear bus stories. The good news, I guess, in WA is a lot of the bus desires are funded. I mentioned a 5-year expansion of the bus network, about almost 25% in terms of service coverage, service kilometres, an increase, a continued replacement of fleet, plus an increase in bus numbers as part of that package. So, and the sinking of the Wellington Street bus station, the city, one of the 2 city bus stations, is funded, albeit it hasn't started yet. It starts in mid-14 through to mid-16. So on the bus side, going okay. On the train side, I have a lot of things we'd like to do. I'm not sure this audience wants to hear them, but anyway, I mean, we have more trains on order, but we need probably more again. The biggest package we have at the moment, trying to get Treasury funding, is what's called a resilience program, so that if things go wrong on the train system, you have greater resilience. That's all about how many substations we have, how many turns back we have, what signalling we have, and so on. The great thing is, I guess, for this audience, and particularly for our contractors, because I know the Perth guys are here, is that when something has gone wrong on the train system, the buses have responded very well, and it's been extra work for them. So it's a downside for me, it's an upside for them, Peter, so there you go.
And I guess an expansion of rail is not necessarily a zero-sum game for buses either. If the buses are feeding the rail, it can actually, both sectors could grow quite rapidly.
Absolutely. You really want the role of an integrated network to grow and to have, I guess, greater relevance to the whole community. And I think probably in the last decade in Perth, public transport has gone from a story that no one even thought about to a story that people actually, it gets a lot of media coverage and is a a more significant factor when elections come around.
No.
I'm not looking for a lot of money. I guess from what I said before, we've got to get people's minds moved to the passenger transport options. But if I was going to put some money in right now, it would be about protecting the freight rail corridor we have now, which is going to not be a freight rail corridor in 2 years' time. It's 20 kilometres, runs right through the population centres in Hobart towards the north. It could be a light rail network, but let's make sure it may not be a light rail network straight away. It could be a bus network straight away. But if we can prove that up by the corridor planning, get the light rail network either up or into the future, and use buses as a conduit to that, we can do a lot better for our Hobart-based passengers, I think.
I can only really echo what's been said elsewhere. I think we've got a lot of really great frequent services in place, but they are getting caught up in our, albeit limited, congestion that is there for half an hour, 40 minutes in the morning. I think we've got some really great things coming. We've got real-time passenger information that's just in the final stages of design. We've got a contractor procured for that, and so we'll have real-time passenger information in place by, I understand, towards the end of 2013. And I think some of our bus station infrastructure also really needs upgrading, which will really help with that infrastructure improvements. Major transit ways. I guess if I had some more money, maybe we'd look at building an extra bridge over the lake.
But what I'm hearing is evolution, not revolution. I just want to ask the second bit of John Stanley's question, which is, you know, I've got my Myki here, which I can use in Melbourne. Am I going to be able to use it in Sydney, in Brisbane? Am I going to use my go-card in Melbourne? Are we going to get that smart with ticketing?
In WA, we're a long way away, and sometimes that's a good thing, Peter. I can remember in the early days when we were designing our smart card system, we were certainly starting behind a couple of other cities, and there were conferences called for a national smart card and so on, an attempt to make us all comply to some national scheme. Luckily, that didn't really get any traction, and I'm glad we've got a smart card system and have had it for quite some years and it works well. Sometimes things don't have to be done on a national stage to work well.
Our new Metro card's probably got more similarities with an exchange with Paris than it does with other states here. So we're rolling out a new card and we're quite happy that it'll serve our needs.
So John Stanley, the answer is no. The answers go to Paris. You might be able to use your card there. Again, I'll invite further questions from the audience if you have them, but I want to come back to two issues. One is the funding issue, and one is the question of changing mindsets. Now, Norm, you've raised that in Tasmania, so it's not about funding, it's about getting people out of their cars and onto public transport. Can I suggest, and I'd like a response from all of you to this, or anyone who wants to respond, the only way to get people out of cars and onto public transport is, and I'll come to that question next, is to make cars less convenient. As long as cars are incredibly convenient and cheap, you know, if it's cheap to park, if it's easy to park, people are going to drive their cars. They can chain trip, you know, they can pick the kids up and go to the supermarket on the way home. It's comfortable, they can listen to the radio, all those sorts of things. I mean, as long as there's that disparity, and you know, we see it in public transport, I suppose, in Melbourne and Sydney, people who live in a city, because of the congestion, they will catch public transport. But doesn't there have to be a rebalancing of public transport and the car?
I'm happy to start on that one. Look, I think I have to disagree with your premise, because I think the things we can sell about public transport are probably more about the quality of your time when you're using public transport. If you think about what you can do on public transport, you can be reading, you can be spending that time thinking, you can be spending that active time not going to the gym by walking. You know, I actually moved to a place 1.5 kilometres away from a major public transport stop and I walk. I don't go to the gym. So, you know, I actually get my exercise by walking to public transport. It actually can save you time by having public transport. So I think there are some other advantages that aren't going to be on travel time alone or cost alone that can actually be sold to help with this sort of hearts and minds approach as well. We've done some great promotion work, for example, with our colleagues in health around promoting our bike cage network to get people more active, and it's about taking the gym to work, for example.
I mean, I agree with you about cost. I mean, because I live with good access to public transport, we're a one-car household rather than a two-car household. That's saving me thousands of dollars a year. So there is a cost saving, but I think that cost saving is often not apparent to people. They don't necessarily see it. But let's take the question at the back, in the middle there. Yep.
Yeah, g'day, it's Stuart Keaton from the newly formed Translink division in Queensland. My question is probably more around, currently we're all focusing about the city centres and how we meet those challenges. And we talk about value for money. Just be great to hear from the panel the different ways and the different models that you use to handle those other challenges where we need to provide more of a community service obligation to those people who aren't living actually in the city centres, probably more in the outer communities who rely on public transport. But servicing that community with a large bus probably isn't the best way to get value for money. So it'd be great to get your thoughts around how you actually deal with that in your different communities, because it's probably one of the challenges that we're facing at the moment.
That's a really good question. I think a very interesting question. I mean, we do tend to have models of public transport based around travel in and out of the CBDs. In Victoria, in Melbourne, for example, only 19% of jobs, around 20% of jobs are in the CBD. Around 30% are in the inner ring, if you include close inner suburbs. But that's an awful lot of jobs that people aren't travelling to the CBD for. They're travelling from one local government area across to the next one or within their own local government area. So that is a real challenge, I think, both in commuter terms, and then obviously there's the social inclusion type issue. So, Ian, you want to respond to that one?
I think that's a very good observation, actually, that out there, and particularly in rural areas, I think we've been very staid in our thinking. And I think I alluded to it earlier, saying that in the services that have been around for a while, there's not a lot of clever thinking gone into the best way to provide services for the community. I mean, I run a significant number of school buses in Victoria each day. They're never full. They often go round each rural community within the state, picking up the children. But until today, we've never actually looked at whether we can use them for those communities in a more effective way. And we're about to do a trial, actually, out in a couple of rural areas to see whether we can actually use some of the seats on those buses for the benefit of those in the community who would also benefit, actually, from a service each day into the local town. So I just think we've got to start thinking outside the box a bit more. And also, I agree with you, I mean, we've got to get away from thinking just about the big bus and thinking about other forms of accessible transport that are often actually much more cost-effective to provide.
Can I ask a follow-up question about big buses versus small? What is the obstacle to having smaller feeder buses? Is it an industrial relations issue? Is it a fleet management issue of having different sized buses? Why isn't that happening already? If big buses are half empty, why aren't we running smaller ones?
Oh, it is just an efficiency issue, Peter. I mean, the bus operators in the room would understand it. I mean, there may be some routes that possibly lend themselves to a small bus. We now have a 20-year public transport plan that's been out for community consultation, but years ago, 1998, we launched a 10-year plan. That actually talked about mini-links, and there was this vision of smaller buses. But as anyone in the bus world here knows, in a real public transport market, perhaps not a country town market, a bus does a trip perhaps that doesn't have many people on it, but the next trip it's on, in terms of its roster and once it's been scheduled, may well be a trip with a full standing load. And the cost inefficiency to take that bus back to the depot and switch it off, it doesn't make sense. I mean, people have done the numbers before. Don't get me wrong, we get letters about it all the time, but we aren't that silly.
Please.
Yeah, look, most of the agencies have done fairly thorough investigations on customer value propositions around bus services, and one of the things that comes out of that is that people like to get on these services and stay on it till they get to their destination. In those circumstances, you're tending to build up the numbers as you're getting closer to the destinations, and the bus sizes are determined by that formula. If you can get yourself into circumstances where you've got a hierarchy of services and efficient interchanges and a community acceptance for those interchange situations, that sort of flexibility becomes very possible and very quickly.
Okay. Any other responses to that question about radial travel in and out of the inner city versus other sorts of travel that people might want to do?
I think on the question we have been talking about, flexibility is the key, which has already been mentioned. Some of the most popular services we have in Adelaide are those that would go in circles around the city, and they are proving more popular whenever we provide those services. People that link regional centres around the metro area, they're popular. In our regions or country towns, we contract separately for services in those areas to meet the needs, but we've got the same issue, as has already been mentioned. Education buses run separately to us, and they're likely to go deliver a school service that has no bearing and no interchange with what we do in regional services.
Yeah, Les.
Yeah, top two reasons for people wanting to use a bus. The first is that if the total travel time's approximately equivalent to the car travel time, we'd get a big increase on those bus services with stops. So that intimates that we've got to look at bus priority. The second top reason for them wanting to get on the bus is difficulty in parking that comes out. So they're the sort of key issues around growing bus services generally.
Okay, do we have further questions? There was one down here. And I do want to come to the question of funding as well, but we'll take this question first and then I'll talk about funding. Microphone coming to you right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Peter McKenzie, bus operator in Victoria and Northern Queensland. I would just like some comment from the panel just about where they see the current planning environment within their ministries at the moment. Of course, you start with your urban planning, get into transport planning, come down to modes and ultimately end up in plans for bus. How do you see the current planning environment, you know, the strategic planning, the urban planning, the transport plans as they currently sit within your departments? From an operator's perspective, and Mark from WA has spoken about it, that in my experience with WA, there is a plan, a set plan out there that has a 10-year horizon, policy guidelines, planning principles, all those sorts of things that are known, understood and passed to operators and industry to work to. How does the planning environment sit across the states, and are the Directors General comfortable with what plans they've got on foot at the moment?
Okay, who wants to bite off on that one? And I'm interested too in whether you think part of, I mean, Les, you've mentioned land use planning. Does that mean we have to think about the shape of our cities, levels of urban density, where people live, that sort of stuff as well? Is that what you mean by land use planning? I mean, Les or whoever wants to jump in.
Look, it is an interesting question. Are we happy with where we're at now with these public transport systems? No, we're not. We see significant improvement coming. Strategically, do we know what we think is going to happen over the next 15 or 20 years? There are some indicators we're fairly confident about. Population increase is one of those. The implications for Sydney, we're expecting about a 50% increase in bus usage over that time. The number of buses will grow from 4,500 to 6,000. Their spatial distribution will depend very heavily on where that land use occurs. It'll depend very heavily on the relationship between employment areas and where people live. Very difficult to predict that accurately. That means that you've got to be flexible about the way you design your systems, regularly review them and update them in response to demand that's actually happening, but have a strategic view about the size of the task that's going forward.
I suppose from my perspective, from an operator's perspective, 15, 20-year plans are, as you say, very strategic in nature. From an operator's perspective, 3 years, 5 years, maybe to 10 years is really where we need to be setting our plans. And particularly as you see in changes over the world and across Australia in the last few years, we're in a very different position now to where we were some years ago. So what I'm curious about as an operator is where we're off to in 3 years, where government would like to see the plan in 5 years, and perhaps more strategically where they'd like to end up in 10 years. Yep. So from an operator's perspective, the local service planning, network development and service delivery functions that we do, we have clear guidance on. And just the other part to the question is, if that environment is set, as Mark Burgess was saying, how does the various states see the relationship evolving with industry and with operators to get those service plans delivered?
Okay, I'll invite further responses to that. I mean, I guess there's a tension here, isn't there, between planning for 10 and 15 years and dealing with change as it happens, because, for example, in Melbourne, the dramatic increase in travel, in jobs in the CBD and travel into the CBD was not predicted by anyone, as far as I understand it, but between 2000 and 2010 we saw this sudden increase in rail travel, in particular all public transport. So how do you get that balance right so there's certainty for industry, engagement with industry, but also flexibility to deal with change that you didn't anticipate?
You're absolutely right, that growth wasn't seen, and it's not surprising because it was really out of the box. It's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? I must admit I start to cringe when I hear about strategic plans, because they're usually just that and nothing more. What we're trying to do is take a slightly different approach with PTV. I can't talk about the department in the sense that I don't look after that side of the strategic planning. But what I do is sit with the head of Vic Roads and the departmental secretary in a very small group that basically runs that process to make sure that we are very, very intimately plugged in to the bigger plans for the state, for the city. But what I'm interested in is looking forward and projecting growth and effectively almost writing timetables in 2 or 3 year increments for the next 20 years to actually find out precisely what we need to satisfy public transport demand going forward. And I don't think we've done that very effectively before. So whereas I'm planning ahead very, very tactically as well as strategically to know what resources we need for the future. We've done that with rail, and in fact in my bag over there is the first strategic rail plan. It's not really strategic, it's tactical. We're going to do the same for tram and for bus over the next 12 months, and then update them every year as circumstances change. I hope that answers the question. The danger is with strategic plans, you get away from reality, and you put them on the shelf and look back at them at 10 years and say, well, that didn't happen, did it?
And you know, part of the question was about what's the level of engagement with industry, about developing that, in your case, tactical plan?
I think in terms of the first plan, which was rail, very close liaison with our operators. We haven't actually started the tram and bus processes yet, but we'll have to do that. I think it's very important that we sit down with our contractors and we have a common vision as to where we need to go over the next 15 to 20 years.
Okay, other responses from the panel?
Peter, we have a 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. And planning is fully integrated within our transport agency. We don't have a separate planning department that's different to our transport agenda. One of the clear messages in our 30-year plan about the shape of our city is we can't continue to say to our kids, if you want a home, you drive till you qualify. That is, get in a car and drive out of the city till you find a block of land that's cheap enough that you qualify for a home loan, and then spend the rest of your life with 2 cars on the fringe of the city. We are trying to change that. Brownfields redevelopment based around public transport and getting a message to our community that if we can do this right, you won't need 2 cars. We can be 1-car family, or maybe even choose to not have a car, get on a bus, get on a tram, get on a bike, and use the alternative form of moving around the city.
Peter, I think you need both. Obviously, Les has mentioned, you know, the long-term planning certainly influences the future shape of your city in terms of land use planning and how the transport corridors fit into that, whether they're train or bus or light rail. So if you don't look that distance ahead, you'll never protect the corridors and the pieces of land that you need. But I think Peter McKenzie's spot on. Unless you're looking at the real thing, the next 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, 48 months, then it means nothing and you actually don't make improvements. About 15 years ago, we created a service development plan, which is, looks out about 5 years and it has idealistically, not necessarily funded, but idealistically, what we'll do month by month for the next 5 years, subject to funding, and sometimes subject to rationalising some existing services that are underperforming. But we have that very open conversation with our operators in Perth. We only have half a dozen people in our own government service planning area doing that work. Each of our operators is pretty lean and mean. They have about 2 or 3 people. And between that team of people, they've led to some of the best improvements in public transport Perth's seen for a very, very long time.
Okay, you're going to have maybe a chance for another question if there's one in the audience. I want to ask about funding. I mean, obviously, we're not going to see what John Stanley would like to see, and that is a sudden bucket of money appear on the horizon. We're in a fiscally constrained environment. All government, state and federal and territory are concerned about not going too far into deficit, so we're not going to see an easy source of money for public transport. So does that mean we have to start thinking about new ways, more innovative ways of raising finance for the kind of changes we want to see? I'm thinking of things like congestion charging, like capital recycling, which might mean selling off freeways and tolling them, allowing private operators to toll them, and then use that revenue to invest in public transport. Particularly then if that's smart tolling, so it's based around time of day charging, congestion and that sort of thing. Do we need to think about getting a better return on the fare box from public transport? I live in inner city Melbourne. I'm essentially massively subsidised to use public transport in a well-paid job into the CBD. Should we be having time of day charging on fares? So we've already said we've made it free in several jurisdictions for people over 65 to travel out of peak hours. Why don't we charge people more to travel in peak hours? Why don't we've got smart cards now, should we be looking at reverse travel discounts? So if I'm travelling against the flow, I travel cheaper. Are these the sorts of things we need to think about in order to find the revenue that we need and get a more efficient use of both the road network and the public transport network?
Peter, I think everything you've talked about does need to be on the agenda, because I made the comment right up front that community expectations will exceed our ability to pay. Congestion charging would be hugely contentious. I don't think any state would pick that up. Increasing public transport fares, although you're volunteered to pay more, I don't think any state will be picking that up. But
I ride a bike most of the time, so really I'm not going to be
I think the whole agenda of how we finance infrastructure going forward, we're all paying more now for our electricity, we're paying more for our water. A lot of those are fully cost recovered. I don't think we'll ever have full cost recovery on public transport, but there are new ways of funding infrastructure that I think have to be investigated, and one that I was going to mention early. Adelaide has 41,000 car parks in the CBD, more than any other city, double what is in some other cities. It's ludicrous, and that's one of the ways that we should be reviewing it, or maybe we put a levy on car parks, but I hope there's no media here to pick that one up.
Well, levies on car parks have been done in other places, of course. They have one in Melbourne. But, yeah.
A few people have mentioned that with public transport you've got a lot more things you need to include in the analysis. It's not just economic, I think, as Les said. But one of the problems we have, a few of us that sit around in the transport agenda, is that it's very difficult to see going forward in the next 10 years how any transport infrastructure is going to be funded, not just public transport. So the whole transport agenda needs to be looked at in the way that you can get cross-modal comparisons. You can decide if the road needs upgrading, or the rail needs upgrading, or the passenger transport needs on the same playing field. Now, I think that'll take us 10 years. But it will happen because all of us have some form of utility to the way, aspect of the way we do things. I think it's starting to happen. It's certainly starting at the moment with the heavy vehicle network around Australia, and it will gradually come as governments understand that there needs to be more cost-reflective pricing in nearly everything we do, and maybe that will give passenger transport a bit more of an edge because it takes in the social benefits that we are providing, not community service obligations, but the benefits to the broader economics and the social economics of a city.
Okay. Anyone else want to respond? Yeah. Ian.
I think there's little doubt that times are going to be tough for a while, and anybody who's been over to Europe and seen what's happening over there at the moment and think that we're somehow immune from a correction, I think are very wrong. But I think it's really important to understand the difference between finance and funding here, and it's often misunderstood. There's plenty of finance out there, private finance. You know, I can go out and borrow billions. There's no doubt about that. But there are two problems that come with that, or challenges. One is the fact that any private investor will expect me, on behalf of government, to also put some of my money in, some equity. And that is a problem in the existing financial environment we're in. And the second thing is they expect to get a return on that money, surprisingly, and normally quite a handsome return. And therefore I've got to find revenue, I've got to find means to pay for that. And that again is a problem. The state governments, along with the federal government, have a reduced tax intake, and times are very, very hard. Some of us have got bigger structural deficits than others, and they've got to be corrected. Otherwise, credit ratings are going to go the wrong way, and it'll be like the credit card, it will just accelerate out of control. So in my mind, the way to deal with this, and I'm sorry to come back to virtually the first question, is to get better value for money in what we already do. That is the way to start the virtuous circle going in the correct direction. So I think rather than ask people for more money, we've got to do things better with what we've already got.
Okay, very last chance for a question from the audience. Yep, we have one over here, thanks. Because we need to wind up in 5 minutes. So. The microphone coming to you, jogging all the way around the outside, luckily. Here we go. Yep, gentleman here, thank you.
Thank you. Just a question to the panel from a supply point of view. You're all relevant experts in your states and you talk about different modals. My question is, when are you actually going to get together and realise that a school child in Queensland is the same as in Western Australia or New South Wales, and try and get some efficiencies out of the capital cost of the vehicle? The Federal Minister said this morning one of the biggest issues he's had wasn't making the decision at the top. It was all the departments below him wanting to change their attitude and their philosophy and come along for the ride. COAG, different things like that. At your level, do you actually get together and say, well, let's have one school bus for Australia? Whether it's going to be seat-belted, non-seat-belted or whatever, let's get one specification. Let's not have a yellow one, an orange one, a white one with a red stripe on it. Let's get some efficiencies right at the start and lower the capital cost of the equipment. Because every time we talk to an individual state or transport department, they say, oh yeah, we're going to do it, but nothing ever happens.
Okay, it's a good question, and it was one of the other questions on my list too, around whether there is a need for, whether there's an ideal provider model, whether there should be a uniform provider model, not just for capital equipment, but also for services delivery and so on. So, Les.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I understand the frustration. There is the Standing Committee on Transport and Infrastructure that's chaired by Minister Albanese that all ministers go to. Those ministers determine items for national harmonisation. There's also the COAG process. National harmonisation is slow. Many states reserve the right to implement services to their community to suit their own community's needs. Understand the frustration. We do have to work to standardisation of vehicles, vessels and rolling stock, and to contract arrangements between providers, and it will save money. But there are some practical difficulties in doing that. There are some timing issues that need to be dealt with. Are people working on it? Yes, they are. Is it happening too slowly? Yes, it is.
Any other responses on that? Rod?
It's taken us 100 years to get to the stage through these standing committees of having national regulation of rail, of heavy vehicles and marine. I suspect it'll take another 100 years to get to the stage of national procurement.
100 years, that's a long time. Anyone got a more optimistic view of that? Or?
I guess I think, yeah, it's a great question. I did see Vic sent around a thing before looking at different papers there, thinking of sponsoring from a federal point of view, and one of those papers was that. And I know definitely Queensland was supportive of that, so I think if something like that happened, would be quite supportive of that paper.
Okay. Well, Ian.
I seem to remember the national safety regulator was being proposed when I arrived in '93. We haven't got it yet. I think it's imminent. That's pretty bloody poor, actually. And I think really, although we're obviously working within a political system that's not easy at times, we need to look at our own performance and say that we need to get together as a group and get a few things sorted out.
All right, look, I would like to thank the sponsors of this session, Heritage Finance, for supporting the session. I'd also particularly like to ask you to join me in thanking our 7 panellists who have put themselves on the spot. They're going to go away now together, have a talk and sort out all the problems, because we know that cooperative federalism is the way to go. So please join me in thanking them for their contributions this morning.